Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you, Tricia, my wife, who works with me and is also an author right here. We know about Hillsdale. We've read about it. We have followed. We've been online. And over the years, we've seen what this college does. We understand that it's one of the last places in America where you can get a classical education. What we didn't appreciate is how vibrant this community was and this college is until we actually got here. So it is amazing. I grew up on debate. I was on debate in high school and in college. It's what I always engage in. It's what I thought you had a bad idea from somebody. You got rid of the idea by engaging it in the public square and showing why it was wrong. And we have trouble doing that nowadays in this country. And so it's fantastic to be here. I thank everybody at Hillsdale who's made it possible, and I thank you for being here. So, yes, this is some of the book. Pharma's not here. Don't worry, we're talking about Pharma. These are books Tricia and I have done over a period of time. I'm particularly proud of Why America Slept because it was the story that showed how the CIA and the FBI missed all of the warnings for 9/11 and why 9/11 didn't have to happen. And you knew that you hit a nerve when it was published and they started to come after you, as they do, and said, no, that's all wrong. The Saudi book, Secrets of the Kingdom, we're proud of because we both got banned from entering the kingdom. So that was good. That was a good reason not to go there. God's Bankers, I'm raised Catholic. I went to Sisters of Charity for grammar school and Jesuits for high school. And this is the story, a 200-year history of the Vatican. And the Pope cannot tell us in enough ways no when we try to get access to the secret archives. So we are still failing to do that. But we have a lot of fun. We like to pick topics that we think there's something new on. So when I went to my publisher and said, what about a history of the American pharmaceutical industry? They said, you're crazy. And then I said, no, I think I can do it. And 5 years later, we turned in a manuscript, and it was interesting to do. What I'm going to talk about tonight is in part the opioid crisis. But to get to the opioid crisis, you need a little bit of background and history about what I call the DNA of pharma. What makes the American pharmaceutical industry different than just about anything else that you have? One of the things, by the way, on pharma, when it was finally reviewed on different journals, you'll notice a word came up that my publisher hated because they say nobody buys an encyclopedia. People buy a page turner. But reviews would say an encyclopedic book, and they would just say, oh no, why did we publish this book? But actually, for a writer, that's always a good thing to see. Now, one of the things about the American drug industry, it doesn't start, we think of it today as this industry that's so large that it's always been like this, but it actually starts in the middle of the 19th century, around the time of the Civil War. And why? Because there's a tremendous demand for morphine. Morphine is one of the few things that people know works, and it ends up working to stop pain, and there's a need for it. So some people decide to get into the business. So there are these two German cousins. They are Charles Earhart and Charles Pfizer. They have $2,500 in savings and $1,000 loan. And a year into the Civil War, they established a plant in New York, and they are manufacturing just high-quality morphine. And that's enough business to start Pfizer and its growth to what it is today. Edward Robinson Squibb, he was a naval wartime surgeon. He threw adulterated morphine overboard when it arrived that was bad when he was actually in the Civil War, and later knew the demand for quality morphine and ended up creating that company together with his two sons. Some of you might be familiar with two pharmacist brothers in Philadelphia, John and Frank Wyeth. Same thing, Civil War. Morphine is their first initial product that they're putting out. About 70% of their sales end up coming from that drug alone. A chemist and a Union Army colonel, Eli Lilly, he knew the importance of morphine and good quality drugs because he served in the Civil War. He tried to open his company, Eli Lilly, a year left on the Civil War, but he didn't make it. He opened up just at the end. Still, it was a painkiller that was his seller for the first 10 years that Lilly was up and running. Bristol Myers, same thing. John Myers and William Bristol, two investors who put up $5,000 each to buy a drug firm they renamed as their own. They did also have a good seller. They had a mineral salt that was supposedly a pain reliever, but morphine was still their number one seller. And if you think it's not just all the names, Harvey Park was a miner turned investor. George Davis was a 27-year-old salesman. Their big hit Morphine carried them for about 3 decades. In 1900, they patented a drug called adrenaline, and it's an actual part of our body. And other companies said, "Oh, by the way, you can't patent that," and they won a court case. So every other company that has an adrenaline product has to call it epinephrine. So only Park Davis could call it actually at that time adrenaline. And the last ones are Silas Burroughs, a pharmacist, and Henry Wellcome. He was a promoter who claimed to have invented invisible ink. It was just actually a formula of lemon juice that disappeared slowly. It wasn't very good, but they did much better with their firm. You look at these names, it's quite interesting because these aren't just names that we have forgotten about. These are the names that existed and have grown over the time to be in the top 10 of the pharmaceutical industry. They started in a business at a time with an addictive product, granted, but one of the few that worked. And why do I say one of the few that worked? This time, doctors knew there wasn't even an AMA. Doctors knew very little about what caused disease, illnesses, infections. So it was a time that I call the cocaine cowboys day of the American pharmaceutical industry. There goes, I think, the cover on the mic, but it's still working. Anything went. You could have they were called patent drugs. So morphine was available, opium was allowed, mixtures with alcohol. A couple of these products, these were the big sellers for a 30 and 40-year period. Laudanum was marketed by a whole series of companies. That was a tincture of opium, codeine, and morphine. Well, you think that, oh, by the way, it's not enough to have opium? We'll give them a little codeine as well. They still don't look like they fell asleep. How about morphine on top of that? All three. It's amazing more people didn't die. Dr. Seth Arnold's cough killer. That's fantastic. It was about 30% morphine. That'll stop your cough. Vin Mariana. And sorry about that noise. Better? All right. Sorry. Vin Mariana was done by a French chemist. It was the #1 seller for a while in the 1870s. It was restore energy and vitality. It turned out that that was red wine with 7.2 milligrams per ounce of cocaine. I kid you not, this was the pharmaceutical industry. Mrs. Winslow, 65 milligrams of morphine in a fluid mixed with alcohol and a little bit of ammonia water. Now, the biggest seller, this was the one that everybody wanted to get, was Cop's Baby's Friend. This was what you gave to your child so it wouldn't be colic, it wouldn't cry at night, it would just be a good baby. It turns out that, and what they did, they were very, very smart. They went ahead and checked the birth announcements in newspapers to find out when mothers had new babies, and then they sent them a sample, and then they would sell them the product. In fact, it was opium. It did cause deaths, and eventually their business went down. The middle is one of my personal favorites. The Amazon of its day was, of course, the Sears and Roebuck catalog, and they sold for $1.50 a small vial of cocaine and a hypodermic so that you could be able to buy that. So it's pretty remarkable to me. Now, my Trisha's personal favorite is Bayer. The reason I say that is Bayer was a real pharmaceutical company, was selling more prescriptions and more drugs than anybody else in the world. And over a 5-year period, their scientists found 4 different classes of drugs. They found acetaminophen, that was the first, in 1897, pretty interesting, so Tylenol. And then they discovered Bayer aspirin. A couple of years later, true wonder drug, aspirin can be fantastic. And then in 1900, they actually had discovered before that heroin, which they patented after the German name Heroish, and they called it heroin, and that's how it was sold in the U.S. as, any of you guess, a cure for morphine addiction. That's pretty good. That's true. I kid you not. And they invented an entire new class of drugs with barbiturates. Luminol was their first product, and then when they marketed it in the United States, they marketed it as phenobarbital. All without prescriptions, because you didn't need a prescription. You're 18 years of age, you can walk into any pharmacy, you could walk out with any of these drugs. However, Bayer scientists said one of these drugs is too dangerous to market. We've done tests on animals of that, and it looks like it has a high toxicity level. So they didn't put one of them out. You know which one? Tylenol. Acetaminophen was never marketed because they thought that was too dangerous, but no problem with the heroin and the barbiturates. And this is just a quick side note. Even Bayer, drug companies can sometimes hide things they don't like. Arthur Eichengrun, who's the top of the picture there, he was the chief of pharmaceutical science. He was responsible for the discovery of acetaminophen and aspirin. 47 patents to his credit. Bayer did this massive 2,000-page tome, The Official History of Bayer, in 1934, a year after Hitler had become the chancellor in Germany, and they had already Aryanized their company and kicked all the Jews out. So they didn't give credit to Eichengrun. They gave it instead to his assistant, the man in the lower part, a good Aryan, Dr. Hoffman. Well, Eichengrun complained about that and said, I was the person responsible for discovering those two drugs. And they sent him to a concentration camp. He lived. He got out in 1948. He died. He got out in 45, but he died in 48. It took until 1999 for a Scottish pharmacologist to actually track down the story and be able to publish it and give him the credit that he was due after all those years. It's a little side story that I happen to like. Justice comes, but sometimes is delayed. Now, these are the fellows, the new sheriff is in town who start to change the way things happen in the drug industry. This is Harvey Washington Wiley and his Bureau of Chemistry. And Wiley is the person here, if this works. You might see him, if I can get this to work, possibly right there. That is Harvey Washington Wiley. He's the son of an itinerant preacher. He goes to Washington. That is the entire 1900 Bureau of Chemistry. Doesn't look like a typical government bureaucracy we see today, huh? He was, from the very beginning, interested in going ahead and regulating additives to food. There was no regulations on it. He thought he could do something about it. And he was also interested in what he might be able to do on drugs, but food was his major design. He has a thing, he calls for volunteers, and he sets up a group called the Poison Squad by the press. And they are volunteers that dress up in evening wear, and he cooks them dinners with his staff every night in the basement of the Department of Chemistry, and he puts additives like boron and formaldehyde and other things into the food, and he sees how sick they get. One of them eventually dies, but he learns a lot in that process, and he keeps going back to Congress trying to get a bill passed, and they say no, 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 no. And everything, as you know, in Congress is a bit of timing. And so finally, we usher in what I call the progressive era. In 1906, he gets his law, and it's the Pure Food and Drug Act. And that's Wiley's, he's the driving force on it. Also helps, by the way, that at that point, you had a book done in which for the first time you really understand in the jungle, how the meat packing was done in Chicago and how terrible it was. People were outraged by that, and it gave some impetus to finally make the changes in Congress. All the 1906 law did, first federal law regarding food and drugs, was to say that you have to put on the label what's inside. Doesn't have to be safe, doesn't have to be therapeutic, doesn't have to cure anything, even if you claim it does, but you have to tell us what's on the front. And so the first major lawsuit that Wiley brings after the 1906 Act is against Coca-Cola, of all people. He says that's because you have caffeine in the drink, and you don't disclose that on the label, and you don't have coca in the drink, and you say Coca-Cola. Government lost that suit. It wasn't his finest moment, unfortunately. In 1914, not long after, another 8 years later, government passes the Harrison Act, and that bans all narcotics in the country. So all of a sudden, the morphine, the opium, the codeine, the heroin, the cannabis, the cocaines used in thousands of patent drugs are out the window.
Well, that was fascinating. I guess you have to watch the rest of it at Hillsdale.